Hello everybody and welcome to this week's assembly. This Friday is a really special day. It's the 75th anniversary of VE Day, which was Victory in Europe, which marked the end of the Second World War. I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about that in the assembly today. This Friday is a bank holiday. It would normally have been on this Monday, but the government decided to move it last year to a Friday, which gave people who wrote calendars a bit of a headache. But this week we will have a slightly shorter week because we'll have the day off on Friday. So what is VE Day?
Just over 80 years ago, the Second World War began. It was a huge war that involved most of the nations of the world. On the 8th of May 1945 at 3 p.m, Winston Churchill, the UK Prime Minister at that time, announced to the nation that the war in Europe was over. This meant an end to nearly 6 years of war that had cost the lives of millions of people and had destroyed families, homes and cities. Millions rejoiced at the news that Germany had surrendered, relieved that the intense strain of war was finally over. In towns and cities across the world, people marked the victory with street parties, dancing and singing. So let's take a closer look at what happened on VE Day 75 years ago. Here we can see people dancing for joy in the streets. An estimated 50,000 people took to the streets around Piccadilly Circus in London to dance and celebrate. The joy of the day broke down normal social conventions, and people spoke to and hugged people whom they'd never met before. Music was provided by gramophones, accordions and barrel organs, and revellers sang and danced to the popular tunes of the day. In this picture you can see some young people celebrating in the fountains of Trafalgar Square, including 2 young sailors whose war was finally over. Winston Churchill made famous the sign of victory, and here you can see a number of revellers making that sign. This picture shows Winston Churchill, the UK Prime Minister, waving to a huge crowd. Earlier that day, he had announced on the radio that the war in Europe was over.
Yesterday morning at 2:41 a.m. at General Eisenhower's headquarters, General Jodl, the representative of the German High Command, and of Van Admiral Dönitz, the designated head of the German state, signed the act of unconditional surrender of all German land, sea, and air forces in Europe to the Allied expeditionary forces and simultaneously to the Soviet High Command. Hostilities will end officially at 1 minute after midnight tonight, Tuesday, the 8th of May. But in the interest of saving lives, the ceasefire began yesterday to be sounded along all the fronts. The German war is therefore at an end. We may allow ourselves a brief period of rejoicing. Today is Victory in Europe Day.
This was the moment we'd all been waiting for.
Huge crowds with lots of people dressed in the UK flag colours of red, white and blue gathered outside Buckingham Palace in London. They cheered as King George VI and his family, including Princess Elizabeth, our current Queen, and Princess Margaret, came out onto the balcony to greet everybody. Princess Elizabeth and her sister were later allowed to leave the palace to celebrate with the crowds outside, although they had to do so secretly. The future Queen described it as one of the most memorable nights of her life. Church bells rang out across the country, and many people attended church services to give thanks for the victory. After years of wartime restrictions and dangers, including food and clothes rationing, nightly blackouts and bombing raids, people were understandably eager to let loose finally and enjoy themselves. However, not everybody felt like celebrating on VE Day. The hardship of the war years had taken their toll on many people, leaving them with little energy for rejoicing. For many, the celebrations were tinged with sadness. These two girls waving flags stand on the rubble of a bombed out building. For those who had lost loved ones in the conflict, it was a time to reflect. Before they celebrated, many went to churches and cathedrals to spend time in prayer and to remember relatives who had been killed in the war. After the celebrations of VE Day had died down, it took time to rebuild the country. Shortages continued for several years. Clothes rationing lasted until 1949, and food rationing remained in place until 1954. Even today, for some people, their memories of VE Day are still tinged with sadness.
So this Friday is a really important day. It's celebrating the end of the Second World War, the end of conflict that had gone on for 6 years previous to that. And I think it's an important day for us to recognise the sacrifices that people made during the war, but also how lucky we are to live in a peaceful nation, and largely as a result of what happened after that war. It was certainly tough in those times, people having to be rationed for all sorts of things. And we are experiencing some pretty tough times at the moment, but I think we should be thankful that we haven't had to go through what our grandparents did 75 years ago. I hope everybody has a fantastic weekend and enjoys the extra day off, and we look forward to seeing you all back on Monday, ready for our next week of school.